Welcome to In the Margins. I'm your host, Ralph Newell, and today we have as our special guest Clarissa Martínez De Castro, the Vice President of the Latino Vote Initiative at UnidosUS. Welcome, Ms. Castro.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be with you, and please call me Clarissa.
Clarissa, all right, I will for sure. As I, we're doing a series on the youth vote, and earlier this week, I spoke to Dr. Carol Anderson about the history of voter suppression in the U.S. and she gave us a really good history lesson on that. And my intent today is to talk to you more about, voter suppression and how it's impacted Latino youth vote. But before we get going, I just wanted you to set the table for our audience. If you could give us an understanding of the history of voter suppression of Latinos historically and what the new efforts are and how they are impacting the Latino youth vote.
Sure. Let me start by saying thank you for having us on. The Latino Vote Initiative is part of UnidosUS. Unidos is the nation's largest civil rights and advocacy organization. And I like to say that we do our work through 3 Ps: policy, programs, and people. In addition to our staff, of course, we have a network of nearly 300 community-based across the country, community-based organizations who provide a variety of services and other functions serving Latinos and many other folks in our communities. And so we combine those 3 aspects when we look at interventions in a number of arenas, including, of course, civic engagement. On the civic engagement front, the Latino Vote Initiative has 2 main purposes. One is to advance a more accurate understanding about the Hispanic electorate, because there's a lot of misconceptions and mistaken assumptions that compound low outreach and engagement with these voters, or how effective that outreach is when it happens. And then secondly, to also organize programs that help increase community agency in the electoral and in the advocacy space. Because of course, for Latino voters, like any other voters, voting is a means to an end, and the end we would all like to see is stronger communities that allow our families and our kids to thrive. So that's the work of the Latino Vote Initiative. In terms of the Latino electorate, I think that there's a number of interesting things that sometimes are not known by a lot of folks. One example is that I think that there is a perception that Latinos are immigrant and undocumented. The reality is that the majority of Latinos in this country are United States citizens. 8 out of 10 Latinos are United States citizens. And when you look at the population under 18, 9 in 10 are United States citizens. So this is a community with an electorate that is young and in constant motion. What I mean by that is that because of the growth in the community, every year we have about 1 million Latino US citizens turning 18 and becoming eligible to register and to vote. So in 2024, it is projected that about 17.5 million Latinos will be voting. And that's another important note, is that what we have is a voter registration opportunity gap. But once registered, more than 8 in 10 Latinos vote in presidential elections. One of the things we see, and many other folks in working communities see, is that there's not a lot of investment in voter registration, which is what helps bring new voters into the picture. And for Latinos, by definition, a lot of those new voters, the majority of them, are going to be young voters.
Okay. So what specific initiatives or programs are you all doing to help increase this registration and voter turnout?
We have voter registration operations. We're nearing book closing for voter registration in many states. But we have voter registration, community canvassing going on in Florida. We also, because of the dispersion of the Latino community, we have also been doing a lot of voter registration digitally, trying to reach Latinos where they are. We know that a vast number of Latinos get their information and news online. So we have a very effective digital voter registration program. And combined, I know we are currently about 100,000 people that we have helped register to vote. And
Mhm.
hopefully by the end of book closing across the nation, we'll get close to 150,000 people that we have helped register to vote this cycle. And then following that, we will make sure that people get information about what they need to know and do to be able to vote. As you can imagine, with so many new voters, a lot of times, I know it was the case for me, you
Mhm.
think about voting on election day, but in many states, you have up to 3 different ways that are equally legitimate to vote: by mail, early, in addition to election day. And those things are really important because for many Latinos, some of the obstacles they cite to get to the voting booth are transportation challenges or time challenges. And so
Mhm.
educating folks and making sure that they are aware of how they're able to vote by mail or early is also an important part of helping people get to the voting booth. So that's part of the work we do on the agency side is registration, education, and get out the vote. And then on the narrative side, I guess we could say, or an accurate understanding of these voters, we do very robust polling. We released a poll at the beginning of September of 3,000 Latino voters and their views on issues, on parties and candidates, on their values, and how they feel about what's happening in the country right now. And that is a way to try to help press and others understand these voters better. So we created a Hispanic electorate data hub. I hope folks go visit it. You can access it through the UnidosUS.org website. And in it, not only will you find polling going back to for a couple of decades on the priorities for these voters, how they changed or not, and then you will also find the information on the Latino voting age population, the number who are citizens, who are registered, and who voted going
Mhm.
back to 2020.
Okay. Speaking of
Actually, to
2020,
2000, sorry, for 20 years,
I'm sorry, going back to when?
to 2000.
Oh, 2000. Okay. But what I was going to ask you was, prior to 2020, I think there was an unfair perception of apathy with young Latino voters. Why do you think that was? And yeah, well, first of all, why do you think that was the case?
I think that a lot of times, what we are seeing or
Hmm.
what we are hearing from folks when we go to the doors or where we encounter them during voter registration drives is that often they say nobody had ever talked to me about voting or about getting registered to vote. There
Hmm.
have been studies about young Latino voters saying that one thing is that they really don't know how to go about getting registered. And for those of us who are registered, we may not remember back in the moment when we did it, or we may have come be in a family where there was multiple people that were voters by that time.
Hmm.
But the same way that many Latinos tend to be the first ones in their family to go to college and navigate all of that means, many of us may also be the first voter in our family. And
Hmm.
that may not something that is readily apparent to us. And that's why extending that invitation and going out and making sure people are aware of how they can do it and who's eligible is really important. In terms, and I hear, I think everybody who's read about the Latino vote hears these things like apathy or the
Right.
sleeping giant.
Hmm.
Here's the thing. For a community that has one of the highest labor force participation rates in the country and who has a very strong track record of service, the reality is that it's not that people are apathetic. They're unconvinced. I think people feel like a lot of times politicians only come at the last minute when they just
Hmm.
want their vote, or they feel that things don't change enough and they're going to devote their effort to where they feel they can make a difference. The other thing is that there is very low outreach from parties and candidates to Latino voters. And so the message here is if people want to win over the support of these voters, they need to do their homework and they need
Hmm.
to go out there and make sure that the candidate is known, their positions are known, and that they're engaging these voters.
You mentioned, Latinos being a huge part of the labor force. Just in some recent podcasts we did, and even talking with Dr. Anderson earlier this week, we had conversations about migrant workers. I was talking about migrant students, children of migrant workers in Florida and Washington State in particular. And I really just got to thinking about it really this morning, actually. The migrant workers, what data do you have or information do you have in regards to where do they vote? I mean, if I'm looking at the word migrant, it says to me they're moving around a lot, but I can see that preventing them from voting because they're not where they were registered to vote maybe at that time. Any intelligence on that?
Well, for any voter who is eligible, right?
Hmm.
I think that migrant workers are certainly part of it, but you can think about a number of other professions that have people away from where the address where they register to vote. And
Hmm.
that's why vote by mail is also
Right.
so important
Hmm.
because people may not often be aware that even if they're going to be away, if they register to vote by mail, they'll be able to cast their ballot anyway, right? Because
Right.
that they're if whatever they receive, if they receive anything, it's going to go to that address. And that's why one of the tasks at hand is to make sure that folks understand what they need to do to be registered to vote by mail. We know some states are very voter oriented and they send mail ballots automatically to voters. There are other states that are all mail. But there
Hmm.
are many states where if you need to vote by mail, you actually have to actively register. So
Correct.
making sure people have that information is part of the work of educating voters.
You talked earlier about, some of the polling you guys were doing of Latino voters, and but then you also were saying that, there's a sense that politicians aren't really doing the reach out. So what specific issues are resonating the most with young Latino voters in this particular election cycle?
Yeah, one interesting thing is that among the perceptions or misperceptions about Latino voters is that for a very long time, many politicians thought that if they needed to talk to Latino voters, which they didn't do very often, all
Hmm.
they needed to talk about was immigration. Well, that's wrong.
Hmm.
Then when they don't see immigration on the top five issues, the assumption is that Latinos don't care about immigration, which is also wrong. But one of the things that has always been right is that economic issues, economy and jobs has always tended to be at the top of the Latino voter priority agenda. And by the way, education for a very long time was kind of the number one and number two,
Hmm.
the economy and jobs and education. I think particularly when healthcare concerns started getting more acute, and certainly through the pandemic, and now with inflation, economic concerns have risen to the top. It doesn't mean that Latinos don't care about education. It just means that these other things are being felt very acute. So, for
Hmm.
example, right now, as Latinos are looking at the election, four of their top five priorities are connected to the pocketbook.
Hmm.
Again, not surprising given that the huge impact of the pandemic, not only on health, but on the economic conditions of this community. And as you are starting to kind of get your footing after that, inflation hits. So right now, the top priorities are cost of living, and a big driver of that is housing cost.
Hmm.
Number two is jobs in the economy, and particularly the wages that jobs are paying, which are often not enough to make ends meet. Number three is housing costs, whether to if people are interested in purchasing a home or rents. Number
Hmm.
four is the cost of healthcare and medication. And tied for number five is gun violence and immigration.
Okay. Still want to stay on, the outreach. Politicians that do engage with the Latino youth vote, is it talking about the economy? Is that where they have had success, or are there other areas or platforms that are just as influential?
I think showing up is
Hmm.
one big thing. And I know that sounds so basic, but that's not even happening, right? So here's one thing that continues to be baffling. So
Hmm.
about 17.5 million Latinos are expected to vote in this election. We already know, looking at past elections, that Latinos are going to play a decisive role in the political landscape. Yes, in places like Nevada and Arizona, but interestingly enough, if you look at the margins of victory in 2020 at the presidential level, in places like Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, you will see that the number of Latinos who cast a ballot was greater than the margin of presidential victory in those states. Yet, when we ask Latino voters if anyone from a political party, a campaign, or anyone else had reached out to them to talk about registering or voting in this election, and we also said whether by email or in person or by text, 55% had not been contacted at all by anybody. And among those who had been contacted by parties, the highest number was not even 30% on the Democratic side, and the highest level of contact was 21% by Republicans. This including in battleground states, right?
Hmm.
So when
Hmm.
you're thinking about razor thin margins and how to get the support of people, and you look at these levels of contact, you see that candidates and parties need to redouble their efforts if they actually want to be able to win the support of these voters.
Hmm. Do you think politicians and parties are just making an assumption about the vote that, okay, the Latinos that do vote, they're just going to vote this way or that way? Or, I mean, why do you think they're ignoring such a large group?
I don't think Latinos are alone in the respect that they've often been taken for granted. Either
Hmm.
some people take for granted, I'm not going to bother because I'm not going to win their support, or I'm not going to bother because where else are they going to go?
Right,
Right.
right.
And I think that's a mistake. And it is particularly a mistake because this is not a stagnant electorate. As I mentioned,
Mhm.
every election cycle, you're going to see a slew of new voters. In 2024, one of every five Latinos we expect will go to the polls will be voting for the first time. So for candidates who are like, oh, people already know me, it's like 1 in 5 are voting for the first time. And almost 40% of Latino voters are new to the electorate since 2016,
Hmm.
when Trump and Clinton were on the ticket. So folks who make assumptions that people know me, I think the data should tell them that it doesn't, and that they need to make a stronger effort to get these voters to know them.
The 1 in 5 that you're talking about that'll be new voters this cycle. What what would you say is the breakdown of that? Is the majority of that youth vote, or is, folks starting to get, mom and grandma and aunts and uncles out to the polls as well?
It's a mix, but by definition, the largest share of that group of new voters is young voters, right? If you think about 1 million becoming eligible to register every year, that means that between 2020 and 2024, that's 4 million. There's also an additional number of people that are legal permanent immigrants who finally were able to get naturalized, but that number is much smaller than the number of people who are US citizens by birth, who are now eligible and of age. So by definition, the new voter cohort is going to be young voters, although not exclusively.
You know, reaching the voter. So how important is social media and what you guys doing influencing the political engagement process?
It's very important because
Mhm.
one of the things we do is we also keep track and ask in our polls how people get their news and information, so
Mm.
that you see that a lot of folks get their news and information increasingly online. I think it's almost an equal number that are watching YouTube and or television, right? So it needs to be a layer approach. And I think the other thing is that a plurality of Latino voters are bilingual. The next large group is English dominant, and then Spanish dominant. So an approach that really looks at these different categories is going to be important. A lot of folks still get information in Spanish and English, right? And look at multiple channels to do that.
How important is civic education for the first time vote? Well, not, I shouldn't say first time voter, just for Latino voters in general. Like, can you name any effective programs or initiatives that are helping to educate this demographic on the voting process and their rights?
Well, I mean, one of the things, of course, is that we hope that we continue to work and are creating partnerships. We would like to see voter registration become a rite of passage of high school graduation, certainly for Latinos, but for all Americans. The reality is that regardless of the rhetoric out there, we have more of a challenge with getting more Americans voting than people who are out there saying that we have ineligible people voting. That has been pretty much disproven as a problem. But because there's so much attention on those false narratives, a lot of times there's more focus on that than in figuring out how we help more Americans get registered and voting. That is particularly important for Latinos, again, because we're a young population and many folks have not walked that path. So during the pandemic, to use as an example, Latinos who had largely been an election day voter during the pandemic, I think a lot of organizations like us and many others redoubled efforts to make sure that people knew these options available to them so that they could be healthy, health safe, but still be able to vote. And so now you see that the effects of that and that continued education is that about 60% of Latinos are planning to vote early, either in person or by mail in 2024. And about 40% are planning to vote on election day. So that's a proof of how making sure people have the information they need makes a difference.
Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds like, there really needs to be like a lot of grassroots on that. And your point about, a rite of passage in high school, I know that when I was in high school, 12th grade civics class, it was a requirement that we register to vote. That was like one of the things you had to do to pass the class. So, that was opening the doors to, everybody in my area at that time, 18 years old, to vote. But at the same time, there's all types of, especially in communities of color, voter suppression. So, what type of suppression things are you seeing out there that are causing barriers for Latino voters?
Well, there's recurring hits, right? I
Mhm.
mean, how many of us have heard about voters getting calls saying Democrats vote on this day and Republicans on another day,
Yeah.
right? We used to hear that happening on phones. Now we have heard that people are getting those kinds of messages on social media or through other sources. But then there's new and more ominous things that happen. We have seen millions of dollars being spent on advancing a false narrative
Mhm.
that immigrants coming into the country are being brought in to vote in our elections, which is just bonkers, right? First of all, the law is very clear. We already have laws in the books on this. And the consequences are quite steep for somebody who is ineligible voting, let alone an immigrant. So that's not what immigrants are coming here for. But
Mhm.
nevertheless, that is being floated about with millions of dollars behind it. And then that question starts getting seated in the minds of people. So that is also being doubly used because, again, there is a public perception that the majority of Latinos are not citizens, which is wrong, right? We just said 8 in 10 Latinos in this country are actually United States citizens. And so when you combine these things, those dark forces that are trying to use that to undermine trust of elections basically it goes like this. They want to make you believe that immigrants are voting, which there's been plenty of studies and analysis about, and that's not happening. And then put a Latino face on it. So if you buy into that and you go to the polls and you see a Latino voting, you may be led to believe that there is fraud. But the reality is that that person is an eligible, legitimate voter, just like the other people there. And so it opens the door to undermine trust in our electoral system, but also opens the door for intimidation of those Latino voters, right? And
Yeah.
we've seen a number of things like that. So there's stuff on the egregious side like that. And then there's more benign stuff, if you would, that for a community that has high mobility rates, sometimes it's simple things like people didn't get their voter registration card or they don't know where their polling location is. And
Mhm.
frankly, we are right now putting our voter education mailer that is going to go to several 100,000 Latino voters and just trying to figure out how to provide simple, easy to understand information. Sometimes it's challenging, right? Because many states don't make it very easy for voters to navigate the process.
No, there is definitely a whole education needed on that. In another part of my life, I am an election worker, so a lot of the barriers that you're talking about, or things that states can do, what they don't do, I definitely see a lot of that. I'm just thinking about what you were saying earlier about the difference in the vote pattern, not the vote pattern, but the difference in the vote count in the swing states in 2020. And if you looked at the difference between who won and lost, a lot of that can be shaped, or you can look at the Latino vote. How much larger is that number from 2020 to 2024?
There's going to be about a little bit over 1 million more voters
Million more, okay.
this time
Yeah.
than in 2020, right? And again, everybody's focused on the presidential. We know the balance of power in Congress is also in play, and Latinos are voters in many of those states where there's either Senate races
Mhm.
or in congressional districts that are competitive. But of course, another thing that it's important for all of us to do is that during elections, presidential elections, what voters hear about the most is the presidential race, right? And that may be where they have the most information. And as we know, it is state and local races that are so important because they sometimes have a bigger direct impact on the daily lives of people. So part of the education is also to make sure that people, vote for all of those elected offices that may be on their ballot, because all of them have an impact on how things may look in their communities.
Yeah. So yeah, and I get what you were saying earlier about the lack of outreach. But when you get to those down ballot races, Senate, Congress, and local mayor, city council, et cetera, is the outreach better there since it's closer to home, or would you say that's pretty much the same across the board?
I don't have it broken down by whether the contact people received was
Mhm.
from presidential, congressional, or anything
Mhm.
more granular.
Right.
We just left it open, right?
Right.
Democrat from Democrats so it could be any of those.
Right.
That's why the low numbers are even more shocking, right? It was like any of
Exactly.
those.
Wow. Wow. Speaking of polls, I've heard some recent polls talking about the high number of Black and Latino males that are supporting the Republican Party. Why do you think that shift is happening, if those polls are accurate?
Well, a couple of things on that, right? Where the Latino electorate is concerned, historically speaking, the patterns of support have been that when it's all said and done, about 2/3 of the support fall on the Democratic side, and 1/3 has kind of fallen on the Republican side. That was the typical pattern.
Hmm.
In the last 10 years, we saw Republicans lose some ground, and of course, Democrats were picking up some of those voters,
Hmm.
but they didn't solidify them in their column. So in the last two cycles, you've seen Republicans regain back to their third and then going slightly above it.
Hmm.
Whether we can speak about a permanent shift that is different from the 1/3, 2/3, I think we have a couple more cycles to go. What it is true is that we are seeing a churn, right, in support. And there's a couple of ways to look at it.
Hmm.
For Latino voters, a lot of the churn is among new voters. And if we think about the fact that these folks are coming into the electoral arena and forming their opinions about candidates and parties are not reaching out to them, then you can see why a lot of them are actually staying more in the independent or undecided column.
Hmm.
Obviously, come election day, they need to make a decision, but that's where candidates have agency if they decide to actually do the work. So right now, as of this poll that we released in September, I think that support was about 60% on the Harris column and about 31% to 32%, I believe, on the Trump side. So
Hmm.
there's still there a good number of people. That includes leans, right? So
Hmm.
there's still a good chunk of folks who are basically saying, come and talk to me, come and get me.
Right, right. Okay.
And then in terms of the shift, I think there's a couple of things. As I mentioned, economic issues have been top of mind
Hmm.
for forever for this working class community. And Republicans have been very successful at creating a perception that on economic issues, you consider Republicans, right? So I think that is part of it. I
Hmm.
think that the other thing is that Republicans, and they're not necessarily trying to win a majority of Latino voters. And so they can have more targeted efforts. And we have seen indeed in certain locations, people have heard about particularly high Latino support in places like Florida and the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. We have seen that there is intense outreach going on there from the Republican Party to Latino voters, pointing again to outreach matters.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. And I think a lot of people just look at the Latino population in this country as one monolithic group. But, obviously, come from many different backgrounds, whether they be, Mexican American, Puerto Rican, or Cuban, South America. So when you look at this diverse cultural background of Latinos, how does that affect any of the political perspectives among the youth? I mean, do you have to sort of parse them, or do you like to look at it as just one monolithic group?
You have to do both.
Mhm.
And in some ways, that applies to how we understand Latino voters as well. They're both and, not either or, right? I think that in order to simplify things, we try to do either or in stories or other things, and it may go like this, right? Latinos are either a monolith, so they all believe absolutely 100% the same thing, or
Mhm.
Latinos are not a monolith, which means they don't agree on anything and they're completely different from one another. It's not either or. The reality is that there are differences, but perhaps one of the most notable things is that for a community that is this diverse, there's also a great deal of affinity on what the top priorities are, but also on
Mhm.
what the top solutions are that people want to see. And that often holds across states, across Latino subgroups, and across age and gender. So, for example, speaking of Latino male voters, right?
Mhm.
In this shift to the Republican side, you see a larger gap between men than women, but a majority of Latino voters are still on the Democratic side, right?
Mhm.
So that's something that a lot of folks, when they hear about more Latinas on one side or the other, is it's not that Latino men are like on the other side of that column. They're in the same column, just at a lower number, right?
Mhm. Mhm. Gotcha. Okay. Back to our campuses, can you give information to, to our listeners that want to set up voting drives on their campus, in particular for our audience that are at HSIs or in other areas where there is a high Latino population?
Well, I think the most important thing, right, is depending where you are, we are almost, for example, October 7th is going to be the deadline for voter registration in many states.
Hmm.
There are other states in California, for example, you can register up to election day. And there's a few others in between. So the
Hmm.
most important thing, I think, is that if you are eligible and are not yet registered, please get registered. You can go to becomeavoter.org and start the process there. If your state has online voter registration, you will be connected to your state, so that can be faster, right? If you are registered and know somebody who isn't, pass the link along and help them register, right?
Hmm.
Among Latinos alone, there are 13 million who are currently eligible but in need of registration, and there are many more Americans like them. The other thing is that if you are registered, check your voter registration status. You were talking about voter suppression. And
Hmm.
so one of the things that we have seen in some places is voter purges. Now, voter purges are not necessarily a bad thing, right? You want to make sure that voter rolls are clean and people who have moved or who have passed away are not in the voter rolls anymore. But as with everything, things can be used for good and for bad.
Yeah.
And there are places where folks conduct voter purges with a vengeance. And
Hmm.
they purge and knowingly do this, knowing that they'll throw eligible people off the polls.
Right.
Or rather than care of that, they're like, okay, people can figure it out. So just to be safe, you can also go to becomeavoter.org and in 2 minutes check the status of your voter registration. So in case you happen to be one of the unlucky people that got thrown off the rolls, you can take care of it now and either re-register or contact your elected officials to make sure that you are on the rolls when election day comes around, whichever way you decide to vote. So those are some of the things that are important. Of course,
Hmm.
talking to folks in your campus, right? Like I mentioned, some of us, I still remember the first time I voted. I'm a naturalized citizen, so I was older.
Hmm.
And it doesn't matter if you're older or younger. Nobody likes to show up in a place and look like you don't know what you're doing. So in
Right.
my case, I went with my husband who had voted before, and I was
Hmm.
like, okay, who are these people and what are they doing and what do they do when I go to that desk and so on and so forth. So be a friend and tag
Hmm.
along with someone who may be voting for the first time. I think that would make that person feel more welcome and and more comfortable with doing that very first thing.
Wow, there's quick anecdote. Actually, when we finish this interview, I'm actually going to meet my neighbors for lunch because her husband is just becoming a naturalized citizen today. And after the lunch, the first thing he wants to do is to go register to vote.
Yes,
Yeah,
very still in
he's been-
time to do so.
yeah, I mean, he's been talking about it for weeks. He just, I mean, just can't wait. So
And of
today.
course, the other thing
Mhm.
not to forget, right? And you mentioned that you serve as a poll worker is
Mhm.
we also, this is something I didn't know when I first became a voter, that the people you see at the polls are people just like us who
Right.
can sign up and get trained and get paid to be a poll worker.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so because the pandemic, a lot of times it was retirees who used to do that. The pandemic really put a big burden on that, since they also were people whose health was more at
Right.
risk. And so there's been a big effort to educate folks about the ability to serve as poll workers. And so that's another important thing that folks can do in their campuses, is make sure people are aware of that. And you can go to powerthepolls.org and get additional information on that. And they'll let you know if the location that you are, they may already be good in terms of the workers they have, or
Hmm.
if there's a shortage.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I know in my jurisdiction, they're set for this election, but yes, we need people all the time because they quit. I mean, there are people who work for the first time and they won't do it the next time for a multitude of reasons. But I think for those that question the process, it is definitely the easiest and quickest way to find out, how secure voting really is, if you participate in that. And I appreciate what you're saying about not knowing what to do once you get into a polling place. Because, if it's the first time and you're an adult and you haven't seen that process, it can be intimidating. So I always am happy when I see families come in to vote and, parents are showing their kids what they're doing. And then, they, they, they're comfortable with it and they become our future voters. But in regards to like what you were saying in my precinct that I run, I actually have a Spanish officer in my precinct because we have a high percentage of Spanish speaking voters in this polling district, and that is a lot of what she does is helping people go through that process for the first time, and it's A to Z. It's 18-year-old voters, and some of them are 75-year-old grandmothers. So
Yeah.
it's important.
And that's another
Um,
important point, right? That
mhm,
a lot of times we forget that one of the greatest assets we have in this country is the strength of our diversity. That also
mhm,
means that we have American citizens, legitimate voters who speak a variety of languages, right? And
mhm,
that for
mhm.
something as important as voting, they may feel more comfortable in their language. So,
Yeah.
of course, we have had laws that said if there's a certain concentration of at a certain level of voters who speak a different languages, efforts or by law, assistance should be provided in those languages. So that's another important thing about poll workers, right? That in some places, bilingual or multilingual poll workers are also in demand. So if that happens to be one of your superpowers, there's utility for that as well.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean the ballots here are bilingual, and it's like written right together. It's English and there's Spanish. It's just right one right after the other. It's all on the same ballot. And it's just interesting how many people get their ballots and then they come back and they go, "You gave me the wrong ballot." I'm like, "No, that's the right ballot." But all they see is the Spanish. It's in Spanish. I say, look again, the English is there. But yes, that is I definitely see that here in having the bilingual ballots and information. Like everything that we do, it's in Spanish and English to make it more comfortable for everyone. And I think that speaks to what you were talking about earlier. That I forget how you said it. You have some people in the Latino community that are English heavy, Spanish only, or comfortable in both worlds. So I definitely get all three of those that come
Yeah,
through.
there's many Latinos who don't speak a lick of Spanish.
Hmm. Hmm.
Not at all. And
Yeah.
so it runs the gamut. But I think one important thing for me, which whether it's language or anything else, is also letting people know
Hmm.
that they are able to bring somebody to the polls with them, right?
Yes,
It can
you can.
be your uncle, your niece, your brother, sister, like in my case, my husband.
Hmm.
And that's perfectly fine, right? As long as it's not your employer or your union representative, because then that looks like people are trying to place undue influence. But you can bring somebody with you if that makes you feel more comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, whether if it's you having language barriers or physical difficulties, you're blind. I mean, I've had voters who have neurological issues where they can't, hold a pen to mark their ballots and things like that. So yes, you can bring just about anybody in to help you, and just as you stated, with the exception of someone from the party can't do that for you or an employer and things like that, but pretty much anybody.
Yeah, you can bring your support human. to the
Mhm.
polls.
Exactly. And in a lot of cases, honestly, I've seen, in particular, when I'm talking about people who need assistance from Latino voters, sometimes it's parents with small children. I have the kids who come up to the counter with their mom, and they're like in third grade, but they're helping the person to check in.
And that is awesome because when it's their time to do it, it won't be
Mhm.
a new thing, right?
Right.
So that's
Exactly.
another great thing. If you are a voter and you have a younger sibling or cousin that you want to bring to the polls with you so they can start seeing how it works, that's also a great thing.
Yeah. Okay. As we close out here, I really thank you for your time here. If you could just maybe share what, beyond this election, what are some of the long-term trends that you guys see shaping up for not only Latino youth, but the Latino voting electorate?
Absolutely. Well, like I mentioned, right, given the growth of the community,
Yeah.
of the population under 18,
Hmm.
9 in 10 are United States citizens. So you will continue to see this electorate grow. And we are also about more than 1 in 5 of children in schools are Latino, more than 1 in 4. And our numbers are also growing in higher education, almost evenly split between Latinos who start with a 2-year college and a 4-year college. So those numbers are increasing, like with many folks in different communities, right? Figuring out the policies to make sure that folks have the support they need to complete their education is going to be important. Bottom line is, because of the youth of this community, we are not only an integral part of the social and economic fabric of the nation now, that's going to grow in the
Right. Right.
future. And
Yeah.
so making sure that there are policies and programs that help the Latino youth flourish, it's going to
Hmm.
help everybody else, but
Absolutely.
also people who face similar barriers, right,
Hmm.
in the American working class community. And
Right.
last but not least, I would say that where it comes to the electorate, some people may say, well, great, I get why it's important for Latino electoral participation to grow, but what's in it for me? And
Hmm.
what I would say is that because Latinos tend to reject extremes and taking rights away from others, and they care about things like better wages and
Hmm.
affordable housing and safe communities and fair immigration policies, if we have more people in that column participating, then it helps grow the ranks of all of us who care about those issues. And one perfect example is that housing had become a top priority for Latinos before it registered with the electorate in general. And they
Hmm.
have been a great contributor to now putting that issue on the presidential debate stage, where we have both candidates talking
Right.
about housing and what they're going to do about it.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Clarissa. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.